Hello, this is Jerry. Welcome to the Book of Esther, Part 2. The year was 483 BC. King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, reigned comfortably from 4 different luxurious capitals over the huge Persian Empire, the largest empire up to that time in history that we know of. Xerxes inherited his empire. His grandfather Cyrus the Great did most of the work to achieve this. Remember when Cyrus took Babylon during the big party under King Belshazzar with the handwriting on the wall as recorded in Daniel 56 years earlier. But Xerxes will enjoy the empire. We read last week in Esther chapter 1 of the king's 6-month feast for his highest ranks of his leaders from around the empire. 6 months? Who's doing all their work while they are away at the capital whining and dining? And try to imagine the royal expenses for all this food, drink, and entertainment and whatever. Why? The book plainly tells us the answer. He gave a feast for all his officials and servants, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness. It's a long time to fixate on those 2 points. This 6-month feast was followed by a week-long feast for all his leaders in his lavish Susa palace. Queen Vashti hosted her own banquet nearby for the women. Everything the king wanted, he got. But then something very unusual occurred on the last day of this last feast, perhaps in the last hours when the wine had flowed aplenty, Scripture noted. King Xerxes, for perhaps the first time in his royal pampered life, asked for something that was too expensive. Not too expensive with his own money, but too costly for the person he asked. In his drunken state, he had summoned his beautiful queen from her banquet to his to show her off like a trophy before a lot of other inebriated men. But the queen was not willing to pay that cost, because the currency here was her own personal dignity. And that was a savings account for her, not for spending. She said no, either in word or just by not obeying. An unqualified no. And not a whispered no, just between us, but a public no from her feast to his. The king over the largest empire yet was suddenly powerless in his own home with his own wife, the queen. Oh, the public embarrassment to Xerxes must have been overwhelming. The timing was also terrible, because for over 6 months the king had invested a royal fortune to convince everyone of his magnificent wealth and personal greatness. All of those accumulated impressions among the people were immediately replaced by this unbelievable final act by the queen. Now everyone would be focused on this juicy scandal within the king's own home. It's not that the king didn't deserve this. He set himself up for a big fall in God's economy by his prolonged self-exaltation. So the king was filled with rage. Any talk of this being an affront to Vashti's dignity, I think, would have been completely over his royal, clueless head. The king was not used to or tolerant of anybody saying no to him for mere personal reasons. Totally unsympathetic. And today we'll witness in Esther how the king endeavored to save face. Because nothing was his fault, of course. A perk of being king, you get the final say. And we'll see that King Xerxes was not a decisive person. The one consistent decision he made was to let others make his decisions. So he called in all his counselors and said, "According to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs?" All right, let's get ready for their high wisdom. Then Memucan said, in the presence of the king and the officials, "Not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, 'King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come.'" And this is why we've been saying this was a public no. People were aware. There could not be more delicious news. So with lightning speed, everybody in the kingdom will hear. And given human nature, the story will probably gather extra sordid details along the way. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. That is, they will say no to their husbands. All these no's Memucan dramatizes will coalesce together into this huge expression of contempt and wrath by women, undermining and threatening the cohesion of their whole society. I'm sure you could have heard a pin drop during Memucan's storytelling of the enormous ramifications of Vashti's no. As if Queen Vashti had purposely called for all the women of the empire to unite against the men, a battle of the sexes. But what can be done to fix this? Well, Memucan has two quick solutions. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before the king Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another, who is better than she. First, cut off Vashti from the king's presence, not even to see her. Second, replace her with a better, more worthy person, that is, who would value and follow the decisions of her husband, the king. The message to all women: you are not indispensable. You can be replaced. Like if you mess up by saying no to your husband. If the highest queen is replaced because of this, who enjoys lots of perks and privileges, it will certainly happen to all other women. I like the ESV Study Bible note here. Paradoxically, Vashti is to be punished by being forbidden to do what she has already refused to do, come to the king. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed through all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. So this proclamation was to chase down and accompany that first story, so that when people say, "Did you hear how Queen Vashti refused to be summoned by the king?" they'll also say, "And then she was dethroned and replaced. Oh my!" Of course, there's an assumption here by Memucan that giving honor to one's husband can be legislated. There's a common saying I'm sure you've heard: if you have to tell people you're a leader, you're not. In our thinking today, and probably a lot then, honor is earned and inspired. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. Oh, the king loves it when somebody makes a great decision for him. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household, and speak according to the language of his people. That summary statement, that every man be master in his own household, alerts us that this message was for the men as well, to shore up and affirm their patriarchal system, which was the status quo for all the Near Eastern ancient societies. However, I hasten to note that Persia, while a patriarchal society then, was more friendly to women's rights than most ancient civilizations. Joshua Mark writes, "Women in ancient Persia had more rights and greater freedom than any other ancient civilization, including, according to some scholars, even ancient Egypt, which is famous for its respect for the feminine principle in religion as well as in daily life. Many Persian women ran their own businesses, supervised male subordinates in the workplace, and served as commanding officers in the military. End quote. Nonetheless, on the whole, as Masumi Price writes, the patriarchal system prevailed, and husbands and other males had far more rights and privileges than their wives or children. End quote. And in time, women's rights would diminish, and unfortunately, today, women's rights in modern Iran are greatly restricted. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti, and what she had done, and what had been decreed against her. So the king's anger later subsided, and he remembered Vashti. Was he remorseful now, wanting Vashti back? But he also remembered what he decreed against her, and those laws were unchangeable. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel, under custody of Hegai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given to them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. So some of his young counselors, the Gen Z of their day, suggested a way to comfort the king. Start again with a new harem, and select your favorite from among them to be your new queen. A new love to take place of the old. And this pleased the king. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Okay, Mordecai's great-grandfather was taken into captivity by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is, Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Mordecai and Esther were cousins, but Mordecai, being older, took a needed parental role over Esther. And it may well have been that if Esther was underage, as an orphan, she could have, as an exile without Mordecai, have been vulnerable to be pressed into an unwanted marriage or servitude in some household. But now she was a young woman, a teenager to early 20s. And Mordecai holds some kind of administrative position for the government, as we'll see. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Hegai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Hegai, who had charge of the women. So Esther was taken in the netting of a lot of beautiful women to be presented as candidates for the king and for this harem. The verb is passive here. She was taken. She evidently was not in a long line of women raising their hands and saying, "Ooh, ooh, pick me, pick me." And these women were gathered in the citadel of Susa, where Mordecai was. And the young woman pleased him, that is, Hegai, who was in charge of the women, and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. So God gave favor to Esther, so that she won the complete support of Hegai, who in turn gave her preferential treatment in her preparations. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. Her name did not give her away. The Babylonian name Esther meant star, or some say it referenced the goddess Ishtar, and no doubt she went by her Hebrew name Hadassah when among her fellow Jews. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. A very touching story. Mordecai was so concerned for her welfare. And Esther had to come to grips with her situation now, pressed into a harem, and out of that harem one would be chosen to be queen. We really don't know the spiritual temperature of either Mordecai or Esther. Because God chose them for their roles they will play in this story does not mean that they were spiritual giants. Because God meets people where they are and grows them from there into His calling. Haven't you found that to be true? Now when the turn came for each young woman to go in to King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and the ointments for women, when the young woman went in to the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Shaashgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go in to the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. When the turn came for Esther, daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Hegai, the king's eunuch, who had the charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Wow. I like what Wallace Ben writes. There was much more to Esther than just beauty. There was a humility about her. She could take advice, and she listened with respect also to the advice of Mordecai, her guardian. As she met with the king, it's clear from the way the story is written that it wasn't just that he was bowled over by her beauty. There was something special about Esther, something about her demeanor and character that was deeply attractive. I think so. Esther became the new queen. In some ways, like Queen Elizabeth II, who began to reign at age 25. And we were inspired by her selfless service to England for over 70 years. Queen Esther had a whole new life and role to learn. Lots of protocol, what she can and can't do. But as we'll see, God's favor continued to be upon her so that all those who waited on her were loyal and devoted. Now, to finish chapter 2, there's a little sidebar story about Mordecai. In those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So Mordecai was clocked in and working at the king's gate. And don't picture a small gateway. The king's gate here was, according to archaeologists, 131 feet by 92 feet, with 40-foot towers on each end. so a large militarized entrance. Here he somehow overheard or learned about an assassination plot against the king and alerted Esther, and Esther informed the king in the name of Mordecai. By the way, archaeologists in 1904 found and translated tablets that included the mention of an administrative accountant in the early years of Xerxes' reign in Susa named Marduka. Was this Mordecai? Or were there many of that name? And since 1904, a few more Mardukas were named. That is, they found that name a few more times. But we don't know if our man Mordecai was one of them. Now the story introduces the final character, the antagonist. We'll look at chapter 3, Lord willing, next week, but for a teaser, let's peek at verse 1. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. All right, in the modern Jewish feast of Purim, which is March 2nd and 3rd this year, 2026, the book of Esther will be read in the Jewish places of worship, including the lively custom that whenever Haman's name is read, the audience erupts in boos and hisses, and some twirl an awful-sounding clacker, a tradition we will not observe in our class, lest it distract the teacher. More on Haman, Lord willing, next week. Thanks very much.